As your chair, my name is Dr. Kerry Breen. I'm a Melbourne-based physician with an interest in lots of the material that our guest speaker's been covering in recent times, and you're going to really, really enjoy this talk. Peter Gøtzsche is a Danish physician with a very, very interesting background. Went into medicine a little bit later, having started his life as a scientist and worked within the drug industry for a while, so he knows the inside of the industry. And now he's become very, very informed as a doctor about other issues with the industry. So he's going to be talking to you tonight, and he'll be focusing particularly on his most recent book, which is looking at the issues around the pharmaceutical industry in our world. And as you saw when you came in, that book is also available for sale. And if you haven't read it, I'd absolutely recommend it. It's really, really amazing reading. So with little else about Peter's background, because I want you to hear him speak immediately, I'd introduce you, Peter Gøtzsche. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Kerry. Is the microphone working? Yes. Wonderful. And I have a little equipment here. So, most patients have heard from their psychiatrist that they suffer from a chemical imbalance and that they will get a drug that corrects the chemical imbalance. This is wrong. It has never been possible to show that there is a difference between psychiatric patients and normal people in terms of something going on in the brain. Stephen Hyman, former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and many other people who know about this also acknowledge that what these drugs do, they actually create what you can call a chemical imbalance. That's the whole rationale for using them. They create perturbations in neurotransmitter functions. So in response, the brain goes through a series of compensatory adaptations in order to maintain their equilibrium in the face of alterations in the environment or changes in the internal milieu. So the chronic administration of psychotropic drugs creates substantial and long-lasting alterations in neural function. So here is an admission that they create a chemical imbalance, and there is actually good data suggesting that this change can be long-lasting or perhaps even permanent, which animal studies support. So it seems that many psychotropic drugs can likely give long-lasting or permanent brain damage. You don't hear so much about this. But that is the sad fact, that the brain is a very delicate organ, and you don't go in and disturb the brain without a cost. Yes. Now, I will talk a good deal about depression because this has exploded, the number of diagnoses of depression in recent years. And one reason why this has happened is that the criteria for what we call depression has been lowered all the time by American psychiatrists heavily financed by the drug industry. So there was a huge conflict of interest here. More money to be earned by calling more people depressed. And a study by the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention showed that 9% of all interviewed American adults were depressed according to these criteria. But it didn't take much to be depressed. If you had little interest in doing things or little pleasure in 8 days out of 14, you were on your way of being depressed. And you just needed one more thing to get the diagnosis, and that could be difficulty falling asleep or eating too little or overeating, which very many Americans do, or being fidgety or restless more than usual so that you move around a lot, which people do from time to time. And you just need to think of, my classical example is a boy who has been abandoned by her girlfriend. He will feel lousy every day of these 14 days. He can't sleep, he doesn't eat much. There you have a depression diagnosis. It's absolutely nonsensical the way diagnoses are being used in current psychiatry. And when you try these official ways you diagnose on healthy people, which I've done, none of us survived getting at least one diagnosis. And we tried just 3, mania, ADHD, or depression. We all got at least one diagnosis, and most of us were called maniacs. Because I chose some successful colleagues, and these people are dynamic, and maybe they interrupt if people don't tell them anything. They don't want to waste their time, so they interrupt the speaker. They sit impatiently on their chair. They move their feet. Doesn't he soon finish this talk because he doesn't say anything? Then you're already on your way to getting an ADHD diagnosis as well. So then you have 2 diagnoses. So a Danish journalist tried the adult ADHD diagnosis on 8 of his colleagues in Danish radio and television, and guess what? 7 of them got an adult ADHD diagnosis. These were successful people. Okay. I'm not a technical kind of guy. I survived that one. Now, one thing that has been discussed a lot is medicalizing grief. In the psychiatric Bible from the American psychiatrists, you were allowed to feel sorrow for 2 years after you lost your husband or wife before you got a depression diagnosis. But then in the next edition, it was 2 months, and in the most recent one, it was 2 weeks. So I wonder, why not 2 days or 2 hours in the next edition? And clinical practice is not like that your physician looks up in the big American Bible that cost a fortune. That's another weird thing. And say, oh, by the way, I can see we need to wait another 2 weeks before you can get an antidepressant drug. That's not how doctors are. You get the drug immediately, usually. So this says a lot about common things in life. Why should they get a psychiatric diagnosis? This is wrong. And why can't the psychiatrists get enough? They have so much to do already. They are complaining. There are too few people who want to become psychiatrists. They are busy. But they are creating a lot of patients with their stupid diagnosis. And the second thing is that people have difficulty coming off their drugs, so they go on them for years. So they make some acute conditions chronic because of the drugs. So then they create more customers. So why complain that there are too few psychiatrists? They should take people off their drugs instead. Then they would have less to do because many people would become healthy when they got off their drugs. I'll say more about that, of course. Now, a little about, do they work? That seems a funny question. When we eat so many antidepressants in Denmark, which is one of the happiest nations on earth, that every one of us can be in treatment for 6 years of our life, every single one of us. So why can I ask whether they are effective? Well, it's reasonable to ask because they actually don't work. And I'll explain to you why. Here is a big FDA analysis of 100,000 patients on placebo or antidepressants. And half of these people had depression, and 50% responded on drug, 40% on placebo. And mind you, the 40% response is not a placebo effect. It's not an effect of getting a little pill with nothing in it, because if you hadn't done anything, most people would have become better. That is what we call the spontaneous remission, the natural course of the disease. The French philosopher Voltaire said, nature cures, but the doctor takes the money. So it's not a placebo effect. It's a natural, spontaneous cure. There is a Cochrane review of depression in general practice that showed about the same, a 12% difference in effect, and that was a biased estimate because it's based on published trials, and we know that unpublished trials are not reporting big effects because if they had, they would be published. So it's not a big effect. And what does it look like week for week when you get an antidepressant? You can see that here. Fluoxetine or venlafaxine, 2 antidepressant drugs. You start with a Hamilton score of around 21, which means the patients are severely depressed. And then week by week, you get better. The black rectangles are drug, and the white ones are placebo. So it takes a while before your depression score comes down. But the most important thing in this figure is to take a point here where your Hamilton score is 12, and then ask yourself, how much longer does it take before the placebo group comes down to a Hamilton score of 12? It takes 1 week. Why use a drug if you get the same effect by doing nothing a week later? I'm just asking you. And why use a drug that makes people dependent so they have difficulty coming off it again if you can just be a little patient? And mind you, these trials suffer from an important type of bias, and I wonder whether this machinery cheats me because, well, I wonder what happened. We deleted some slides before this session, so I now get worried that something went wrong. It's a funny computer I can't use, so I needed someone else, but let's see what happened. Anyway, the effect is small, and if you're patient, it comes anyhow. Here it comes. The effect on depression is measured on highly subjective scales. Do you sleep better? Is your sex life better? Are you less worried now? It's highly subjective. What happens if your trials are not adequately blinded? These drugs give many side effects, dry mouth and so on. So many patients and doctors have guessed, is it an active drug or a placebo? And we know that if a trial is not blinded and the outcome is subjective, people exaggerate the effect. That's what happens. So one of my researchers collected trials of all sorts of diseases that had both a blinded and a non-blinded outcome assessor because he wanted to find out if you're not blinded, how much do you exaggerate the effect? And what he found was a 36% exaggeration of the effect. That's a huge overestimation of the effect. If I assume that all patients have guessed what they were on and use his correction factor, the effect of antidepressants is 0. And so it doesn't take much unblinding before the effect becomes 0. If just 5% guess what they are on, and this results in a misclassification of the outcome. So if you're on drug and it didn't work, but now I have guessed I'm on drug, and then you say to your doctor, yes, I think it worked. So that's a misclassification. If there is misclassification every time, and you break the blinding in just 5% of the patients, then 40% on placebo comes up to 45, 50% on drug comes down to 45, so you have no effect. You don't need to break the blinding in very many patients before the effect is gone. What you measure is bias. You might think that I'm exaggerating now, but I'm actually not, and I'll explain why. There is a very important Cochrane review where people put something in the placebo in order to blind the trial better. So they put atropine in the placebo. This is a drug that gives people dry mouth, just like antidepressants. So it's more difficult to guess, what did I get? And when you put atropine in the placebo, the effect is gone, totally gone. What they found was an effect of 1 on Hamilton's depression scale that goes up to 52. You don't need to be a statistician to realize that 1 of 52 is not very much. And actually, some researchers have studied how much does it take of an improvement before you can feel it, that I'm slightly better now. It takes 5 to 6 on the Hamilton scale. That's the minimum patients can perceive. But the bare minimum patients can perceive don't bring them back to work. Does it? It probably doesn't. So you have another measure, which is what is the difference that makes a difference to the patient? That must be higher than the bare minimum they can perceive. I hope you can follow me there. So that is even more than 5 to 6. What is clinically relevant is more than 5 to 6. And what you can see is that these studies were pretty old. And that is because placebo-controlled studies are done by the drug industry. And they are not that foolish that they put something in the placebo, because then we could see that a lot of the drugs that are on the market for any sorts of things, dementia, urinary incontinence, you mentioned it, they just don't work. If you put something in the placebo, the effect would be gone. So remember that when you consult the doctor the next time, that many of these drugs we have on the market, they don't work, but all of them have harms, okay? So you should ask your doctor, what is my chances if I'm not treated? Will I die? Or will it be okay after some weeks? And if you have a good doctor, she or he will say, it will probably be okay after a few weeks. Thanks, count me out, no drug for me, please. That's where we need to go. Now, you could also ask patients, they are the best judges. If they don't like drugs, they stop taking them. And actually, they stopped taking active drugs as often as placebo in these trials. This suggests to you that these drugs are totally useless as seen from the patient perspective, because patients compare benefits and harms. And if they don't get anything out of it overall, they drop out, and the same do the placebo patients. So this also suggests that they don't work. And actually, why we treat these people is to get them back to work and to save relationships, save marriages and all that. I haven't seen a single trial that reported on this, although we have more than 1,000 depression trials. So either the drug industry and the psychiatrists never studied this, or they did, and the outcome was so bad for the drug that they didn't dare publish it. I mean, the industry didn't publish it because they would lose money, and the psychiatrists they need something to believe in, so it's not good for their specialty if they start to doubt a drug that they use so much as antidepressants. You can imagine that. So we don't really know what these drugs do to people, but it doesn't look like they do any good. But what we do know is that when the first major newer antidepressant, fluoxetine called Prozac, came on the market, no one liked it. The German drug regulator rejected the application from Eli Lilly, saying that this drug is totally unsuitable for the treatment of depression. Now, the Swedish director for Eli Lilly, he got an offer he couldn't refuse. He wasn't told so directly, but he got the offer of having that drug approved in Sweden. Otherwise, he might lose his job. So he found out who the Swedish psychiatrist was among a group of people who had laughed him out shortly before when he presented fluoxetine for them, telling him, how can you imagine you can never get this terrible drug on the market? But he found out who the guy was who was going to write a report for the Swedish Drug Agency. And already at their second meeting over a dinner, that psychiatrist called Anders Forsman, he suggested to Eli Lilly's director how many dollars he would get in order to write a positive report about this terrible drug. So he would get half of the dollars at once and the other half when the report was delivered. That's like in the mafia, when you order a murder, half of the money at once and the other half later. And also, like in the mafia, no one should see this money. So it was very secret, something about secret bank account and things like that. And he also asked for some money for his research, which he got. And then it took a while before it was approved in Sweden, but that's another story. He did what he could. And what did the headquarters in England do? He fired the guy when he had done everything he could for Eli Lilly. Why? Well, if in the mafia you are asked to murder a political figure, it's safer to murder yourself when you have done your deed, because then it's more difficult to find out who murdered that politician. So it's very similar. So he was fired, but he has written a book about this, which will now become a Hollywood movie, so you can look forward to that. So my personal conclusion is that these drugs don't do any good. They actually don't work on the depression. Many patients and doctors think they work, but that's because they mistake an improvement for an effect of the drug. I've heard several psychiatrists say that in their experience, these drugs are highly effective, but you can't use their experience for anything because they don't know what had happened if they had done nothing. You see? You can't use clinical experience this way. And patients are the same. Some patients will tell you, oh, it saved my life to get an antidepressant. Oh, I would say you are lucky it didn't kill you, because these drugs actually make some people commit both suicide and murder. I'll come back to that in a minute. But again, do they have meaningful effects that matter? Do they save the relationships? I don't think so, because they cause sexual problems in half of those who take them. So is it likely they help saving intimate relationships? It's not likely. It's very unlikely. And these sexual problems are very pronounced. And the drug industry has also tried to hide them, for example, by calling female anorgasmia caused by a drug for female genital disorder. It's your problem. It's not our drug. That is how the drug industry always reasons. It's never the drug. It's you. It's the disease. So the companies reported that only 5% became sexually disturbed, but independent research has shown very clearly, like in this study, that about half or more than half got sexually disturbed, and 40% of them actually wanted to come off the drug because they felt terrible about it. So it's decreased libido, 50% of patients on Prozac, one of the worst bestsellers. How can you turn a terrible drug into a bestseller? You do it by marketing and corruption. Delayed orgasm or ejaculation, half of them. No orgasm or ejaculation, 40%. Can you imagine a drug that can keep a man from ejaculating? It's strong stuff, really. They don't work on depression, but they should have been marketed as the drugs that destroy your sex life. But that wouldn't have sold many pills. Erectile dysfunction or decreased vaginal lubrication, and then some patients yawn during orgasm. That's really fantastic. If you have fallen in love and with a new person, and that person thinks, what on earth is going on? Don't you like me? Oh, yes, I love you. Well, next time, yawning during orgasm, now you have to tell me, what is this about? I don't know. Did you also yawn with earlier women? No, I didn't. Oh, what is wrong with me? And you know, these poor people, they don't know it can be a side effect. Can you imagine treating children and adolescents with these drugs? And then their first sexual experiences, they never had a sexual experience. And they are already afraid of that, which many people are. And then it doesn't work. It must be terrible for these people. Well, these drugs make you dependent. And in the UK label for citalopram, for example, you are told that 40% of patients get adverse symptoms when you try to stop a drug. And they recommend to reduce the dose gradually over a period of at least 1 week. This is a marvelous British understatement. The record I have from a Danish psychiatrist. It took him 8 years to get a person off an antidepressant. 8 years. It can take months or years if they have been on it for many years. And for some people, they never succeed. Most symptoms that occur if you suddenly stop a drug, they are not disease symptoms. You can get depressed, but it's usually not a real depression. It's a drug-induced withdrawal depression. Can you see the difference? And if the psychiatrist then says, oh, you can't tolerate that I lowered the dose, so I will increase it now immediately, then often the patient's depression disappears within hours or a few days. That's not how quickly a depression disappears, because I showed you the curve where it took many weeks. So this is a sign that this is not a real depression. This is caused by the drug. But very many psychiatrists, by far most of them, and by far most general practitioners, they interpret withdrawal symptoms as disease symptoms. So they keep the patients on these drugs forever in some cases. This is a big tragedy in psychiatry. And then we are told that you get dependent on benzodiazepines, the old-fashioned nerve pills, but not antidepressants. But this is because the American psychiatrists introduced new criteria for dependence just before the newer antidepressants came on the market. But it's not true. If you ask patients, do they get dependent on antidepressants? Most of them will say yes. And you should listen to patients and not psychiatrists. I have to say this. And actually these symptoms, I had a PhD student that found out that these symptoms are more or less the same for benzodiazepines and SSRIs. For 37 or 42 symptoms, they are just the same. Now, in the old days when we didn't have antidepressant drugs, a depression maybe lasted 6 to 9 months. And then people were reasonably well, and not very many got a new depression within the next 1 year or 2 years. Some of you will know this. What does it look like now? When you start an antidepressant on 100 people, after 2 years, 60% are still on the drug. After 5 years, 45% are still on the drug. I just told you that half of the people have difficulty stopping, and psychiatrists and GPs, they are usually against patients when they come and say, I don't like the side effects and I don't think it works. Can you take me off the drug? They tend to feel offended. I gave you this wonderful drug and now you say it doesn't work. So they won't help them in many cases. So the patients get desperate. Who will help me with this? And you see what the result is. This illustrates very, very clearly that you get dependent on these drugs. Otherwise, almost half of the patients wouldn't be on them 5 years later. So I will not say too much about the chemical imbalance. It's just a hoax. But I will say one thing. It's being misused by doctors to keep patients on drugs that they would like to come off. You can even hear them say, it's like giving insulin to a patient with diabetes. You wouldn't stop insulin to a patient with diabetes, would you? A professor of psychiatry asked me that question, and then I responded, it's not the same. Patients with diabetes lack insulin. Patients who are depressed don't lack an antidepressant drug. If you are sad and you feel better because you get alcohol, it's not because your brain lacked alcohol. That's not the case. So you can see how foolish all this is, and yet, I'm sorry to say this, but we have a specialty that uses these myths, for example, to persuade patients to continue on these terrible drugs on and on and on, instead of tapering off them, which they should do rather. But they didn't learn how to do it, and they didn't learn what the abstinence symptoms were, so they misinterpret them. Now I turn to a very dark side of antidepressants. Don't we want more than anything else a drug that can protect us against suicide if we are depressed? That's really what we want. These drugs don't do that. Here is the big FDA analysis. What you can see is that suicidal behavior increases up till about age 40, and then it decreases. And we know from other studies that children and adolescents, they have about double the risk of suicide if they take antidepressants compared to not doing that. But what you should know is that the FDA's data are grossly unreliable. It's far worse than what you see here. But when the FDA published their data, it looked much better. Now it was only dangerous up till age 25, where the risk of suicidal behavior was increased, and then it seemed not to do anything or perhaps even be beneficial and protect against suicide. So some people think that if you're 30 years of age, there's no risk of suicide. This is wrong. And now I'll show you a little about the missing suicides. What the FDA found was 5 suicides on 50,000 patients on drug. That's 1 per 10,000. What I found in smaller materials, for example, 9 suicides in just 7,000, that's 13 per 10,000. And these patients participated in the FDA's analysis. So what happened with the other 5 suicides? Where did they go? Can you see? It doesn't make sense. And I have some other materials here on paroxetine and fluoxetine, 14, 17. It's about 15 per 10,000 I have found, and the FDA found 1. So I think there should have been 15 times more suicides in the FDA analysis. That's an error of 1,400%. That's very rarely you see this. How can this happen? Well, the FDA asked the drug companies to go back in their archives and find suicides and suicidal behavior and report back to the FDA. And the FDA assured them, we are not going to check you. And they had already cheated the FDA earlier. So that's like if the police tells a criminal, go back to the scene of the crime and see what you find, come back and report it to me and I'll believe you. And that criminal is in a court case. That's not how the police works. That's how the FDA works. And the FDA did a lot to protect the companies. Eli Lilly sells Prozac. It's a US company. I won't say any more. But I've seen that in many countries, that they protect the drug industry rather than the patients. And what they did was they only counted events that occurred within 24 hours after they stopped the drug in the randomized trials. But what happens after the first day? If you stop an antidepressant cold turkey, which you do when the trial is over, then you introduce abstinence symptoms. Some of these symptoms are extreme restlessness, described as I want to jump out of my skin, for example, which predisposes to suicide and homicide. So in this phase that the FDA didn't care about, there must be additional events. And indeed there are. So I'll show you. But before that, many suicidal events had been coded as something else. So when somebody became suicidal, it was coded as lack of effect, hospital admission, emotional lability, and whatever. And they forgot to tell the world that the patient became suicidal. And only people at very low risk of committing suicide were recruited for these trials. Now, if the drug industry had really believed that they had good drugs, they would have been interested in recruiting usual patients at normal risk of suicide, because then they could demonstrate our drugs reduce suicides. They didn't do that. So I will also tell you about this affects almost all psychotropic drug trials. You take patients that are already in treatment, for example, depression or schizophrenia, then you have a washout period of 1 to 2 weeks where they get nothing or placebo, then you randomize. What does that mean? It means now you introduce harms in the placebo group because some of the abstinence symptoms don't come the first week in the washout period. They come here, they come later. And that can be depression, and it can be psychosis if it's antipsychotic drugs. And then your drug looks far better than it is. So this is most of the psychiatric trial literature is biased because you take patients that are already in treatment and then you create a cold turkey in the placebo group. That's not good science. And you ignore events after the trial is over. And here is a nice illustration. In the FDA analysis, they also had sertraline, which is Zoloft from Pfizer. And now you can see the FDA's analysis, the relative risk of suicidal events, suicides, and suicide attempts was about 1. So Zoloft didn't protect. This was all ages. So Zoloft didn't do anything. It didn't kill people, it didn't protect them. Okay, but when Pfizer looked at their own data, then it looked very promising. Now their drug halved the suicidal events, very different to the FDA's result. But then Pfizer also followed the patient for another 30 days. That was very foolish of them, because then we can see that now their drug increases the risk of suicide by 50%. So we went from beneficial effect, quite large, to a harmful effect. And then we have some British researchers that had access to data that also included events more than 24 hours. And they found a doubled risk, almost statistically significant, but that's not the point. They found double risk of suicide and suicide attempts, and they included all ages. So can you understand that I'm skeptical to the FDA analysis now? I think you can. David Healy, a Wales psychiatrist, he has participated in several US court cases. So he has gotten access to unpublished data from the companies. And he has reported that all the big companies like GlaxoSmithKline, Eli Lilly, and Pfizer, they did similar things that if somebody became suicidal in the run-in period where they only got placebo, then they added this suicide attempt to the placebo group. They might equally well have added it to the drug group. They weren't randomized. And if they came off drug and killed themselves down here, then the argument was, oh, they no longer get any drug, so that's like a placebo suicide. We'll add it to the placebo group. I will leave it to you to decide what you will call this. It's pretty clear to me. Yeah. And just a warning, these things can happen at any age. There are no age limits. And if you are above 65 years of age, antidepressants become particularly dangerous for you because old people tolerate brain-active chemicals very, very poorly. They can lose balance, fall, break their hip, and die. And there is a study from the British Medical Journal that showed that for every 100 people, 65 or older, you kill 3 in just 1 year. This is a huge death rate. It means that we kill around 3,000 old people in my country. We just have 5.5 million, something like that. Why don't people talk about this? I have corresponded with the first author, and it's a very good study where patients were their own control. So in one period, they didn't get a drug. In another period, they did get an antidepressant. That's a good design. And this is what it shows. We don't hear about this. Now, there is an Australian forensic psychiatrist called Yolanda Lucier, who has published about this. And in one of her studies, she looked at 10 people who had enzyme genetic changes, so they didn't metabolize antidepressants as they should do. And they also were forensic cases. And you can see what this was about. I have some examples here that 35-year-old female on nortriptyline, an old drug, distressed due to husband's drinking. Is that an indication for an antidepressant? No. What did she do? Killed her teenage daughter in toxic delirium after 3 days. Fluoxetine, sister was comatose after a car crash. Violent akathisia for 14 days. Killed father 4 days after he ran out of pills. This is so dangerous. So if you're on antidepressant drugs and want to come off them, don't do it cold turkey. It's very dangerous. You need to do it very, very slowly. Paroxetine, distressed by on-off relationship with mother and child, stabbed his partner more than 30 times, and so on. And it just goes on. Distress over divorce is not an indication for an antidepressant. Shot a stranger 4 days after stopping drugs. Very typical. All 10 people were able to stop taking antidepressants and return to their previous normal personalities. When people on psychiatric drugs murder someone, they can appear pretty normal to you. So therefore, it's difficult for the courts to deal with this. They are not normal. They are under influence of something that have changed their brains. They commit these hideous crimes out of character. So when they come off the drugs later on, they are in another position to realize what they have done. But when they're under influence of drugs, that's like LSD and other drugs, they are no longer themselves. So if you ask me, they shouldn't be put to jail. Chief executives of these companies should be put to jail. Okay, I have told you about some flaws. Here's an additional one. It's a valid question for a psychiatrist to say, how long do I need to treat with a certain drug for an acute psychosis and acute depression? And they have done that in many, many studies by taking patients who were treated successfully, and then they randomized to placebo or continued treatment, and then the results are they fare very badly, they fare well when they continue treatment, so ergo, we must continue treatment. And you can see what's wrong with these trials. You introduce a cold turkey in the placebo group. It's a grossly unfair comparison. Now, here is a very rare trial in schizophrenia. These had remitted after a first episode psychosis. Then they were randomized to reduce the dose or stop it altogether, or to continue with their usual dose for 2 years. And after 2 years, their doctor could do what he or she wanted. Now, after 2 years, more people had relapsed in the dose reduction group than in the maintenance continuing group. This looks like that they should still be on their drug. But the main outcome was recovery. Did they get well? And after 7 years, 40% had recovered in the dose reduction group and 18% in the maintenance group. And these people who were in the drug reduction group, 11 stopped their drug versus 6 in the other. And dose was 65% higher in the maintenance group. So they got much more drug in the maintenance group, and the result was better in the discontinuation group. This is one of these rare studies that tell us we must get the patients off their drugs and don't go on indefinitely, because this is the major reason that we have created so many disability pensions after we have started using psychotic drugs as much as we do. They don't cure anything. They make things worse. They can have some benefit in the acute phase, but they are not specific either. They are very unspecific. It's like alcohol. And the main way these drugs work is they either make you slightly euphoric or they knock you down so that you become a zombie. That's the two main effects of all these drugs. That's not very specific. That's not insulin for diabetes. It's not. So these are not good drugs, and we use them far too much. There are a couple of interesting facts here. I don't have a watch. Am I over time already? I'm over time? Pardon? Is that over time? Okay, I'm sorry for that. Okay, I'm terribly jet lagged, so I'm slow cerebrated. I'll do my best. Now, adverse drug events submitted to the FDA, almost 2,000 cases of violence, of which 400 were homicide. And look here, the violence was particularly often reported for what? Psychotropic drugs. Antidepressants, sedatives, hypnotics, ADHD drugs, and a smoking cessation drug that also affects brain functions. Well, and the UK drug regulator tried to get away by saying SSRIs are not addictive, but what did the WHO say? They published a report that noted that the SSRIs were among the top 30 highest, 3 SSRIs were among the top 30 highest ranking drugs for which drug dependence had ever been reported. How can people be so blind that they still try to tell us, you don't get dependent on these drugs? And Gøtzsche said that only 0.2% had withdrawal reactions when they stopped the drug, but they suddenly changed that by a factor of 100 up to 25% in their package insert, and they didn't tell anybody about it. They didn't write a dear doctor letter, we are sorry, we have fooled you and misled you for many years, now we'll tell you the truth. Nobody noticed, really. Do people read package insert? No, not usually. Okay, then some psychiatrists have fought desperately for convincing the world that these drugs decrease suicides, they don't increase suicides. And one of the most, or two of the most polluting people are Robert Gibbons from the United States, Göran Isaksson from Sweden, and now there's another American. They have published many studies where they claim that when sales went down, when the FDA warned against using antidepressants in young people, when the sales then went down, then suicides went up. But these studies are very flawed. And the most recent one was from BMJ, again after the FDA came with its black box warning in 2004. And this study is equally hopeless as all the other ones. And I was one of those who commented on the study. And there were some other Americans who used much better methods and couldn't find any relationship whatsoever. So the scientific literature is polluted to an incredible degree. It's like Santa Claus, that some people want desperately to believe the exact opposite of what the science tells us. And they keep on publishing these studies that are very popular with their colleagues and therefore also in the psychiatric journals. Now, I will say a little about ADHD. It's not, in my opinion, really something that exists. It's just a name. There are giraffes in Africa. I've seen them. They do exist. ADHD doesn't exist like a giraffe. It's just a name. We have some kids that are more difficult than others, more energetic, can't sit still. And then in the other end, we have some people who are too quiet, who sit too much still. Imagine people's heights. We can't all have an average height. There are some people who are small, some are tall. Do we take the tall ones and say, now we will give you a diagnosis, you have a disease, you need treatment? That's exactly what people have done with ADHD. They have taken these children that are not in the middle, and then they say, you have ADHD. And many parents love this because it gives them a pseudo explanation. Now it becomes, little Klaus behaves like that because he has ADHD. Okay. You can't do that. That's a circular evidence. It's a tautology. You can't first say, we have him, he behaves like that. We give that behavior a name. Now the name explains that behavior. Can you see how stupid it is? I think you can. So one of the problems of stopping ADHD drugs is that the parents can be against it also because they get an excuse for their own bad marriage. Maybe the child is disturbed because of a bad family. But now they have a scapegoat. It's you, it's a child. And now he comes on drugs, so everything will be okay. And many of us could get this diagnosis. It has exploded, particularly in the United States. 11% are said to have it. And here is a remarkable Canadian study. It's about school classes. So these people go in the same class, and you look at the middle. Those who are born in December, 50% more of them are in ADHD drug treatment than those born in January. Does that have something to do with astrology? No, it really doesn't. And you can see what the problem is. Those who are born in December have had 11 less months in which to develop their developing brains. So they are disturbing the classroom more. So like with depression, a little patience, just a few days, you will get the same result by doing nothing. I would say about ADHD, don't medicate these poor kids. Just be a little patient. That's my view of this. I actually think that no children should get psychiatric drugs. And ADHD drugs, they work like amphetamine and cocaine. What wonderful drugs to give your children, isn't it? And some ADHD drugs are amphetamine, actually. The major effect of stimulants appear to be that now people are more quiet, so the school teacher is happy, but social interaction and curiosity is reduced. What does that mean for a developing brain? We know that developing brains need a lot of interaction. That's what developed them. So when you isolate some of these children, it's probably not good for them. And then we hear a lot about that it's good to use ADHD drugs because it reduces the risk that the kids become criminals later in life. It reduces the risk that they become cocaine abusers. It's just not true. Stimulants don't produce any lasting improvements in anything, according to the studies I have seen and according to a very large study undertaken by the National Institute of Mental Health. If anything, it made things worse. That delinquency increased when they had been on drugs and substance abuse increased. But they buried this in very sophisticated statistics, unfortunately. They obviously didn't like their own results. But if you read the reports carefully, you can see what they really showed. Animal studies are not encouraging either. They seem, these drugs, to cause anxiety, long-lasting anxiety, long after the animals stopped being exposed to the drug, depression, loss of sexual interest. Virtually all psychotropic drugs affect your sex life. Less tolerance to stress and decreased sensitivity to rewards. Isn't that how we educate our children, to reward them? But they care less when they are on drugs. At least animals do. So why not our children? So I will end by giving you a little anecdote. I have a good friend who is a child psychiatrist in Denmark. She was chief physician. She stopped psychiatric drugs on virtually all children. And for example, she saw a lot of ADHD children, and she saw that they became normal, nice children again when they came off their drugs. And she became so incredibly unpopular with her colleagues that they harassed her, were very, very dirty against her. So one day I told her, you have remarkable results by taking kids off drugs. Why don't you go out, quit your chief physician job, open your private clinic, and focus on detoxification? She has done that now. She has quit. Now she avoids harassment, and she won't be without job, that's for sure. So we need to raise detoxification clinics all over the country, also in Australia, because we have created a massive overuse of psychotropic drugs. And we have worsened mental health in the population, in Australia, in Denmark, everywhere. So this is the way we need to go. And then we need to educate psychiatrists in how do they do this, because it requires a lot of determination, patience, and support from family and friends, because when the abstinence symptoms come up, the patients, because they are drugged, their brain doesn't work normally, they are often unable to judge themselves. You cannot expect a brain under influence to be able to judge the same brain. So these people often, typically, don't think there's anything wrong with them. When they get aggressive and irritable during the withdrawal phase, and the family tells them, you are awful, then they get angry. I'm completely normal. I mean, I'm just me. They can't see it. So you need heavy support from friends and relatives. It's a tough process. And people I know, psychiatrists that have weaned off very many people from benzodiazepines and antidepressant drugs, all of them tell me it's far less to stop heroin in a street junkie than to get people off benzodiazepines and SSRIs. These are terrible drugs that we should use very little. So we should focus on psychotherapy instead. And I'm not alone. Many people share my views that the way psychiatry is today does more harm than good, because drugs have taken over to such an incredible extent. So if psychiatrists and general practitioners don't become much better in handling these drugs, and they should use less than 1%, I think, of what they do today, very little, mainly in acute situations. If they don't come to that point, it would be better we didn't have any psychiatric drug. I know this is a provocative statement, but it's a scientific conclusion I have arrived at during my studies. And I will explain why in a book I published in September that will only be about psychiatry. Thank you.
We are having questions from the audience, so you are free to ask our speaker.
Just quickly, I'm standing as a Senate candidate next year, very interested with a private senator's bill to examine how the psychotropic drug in the community causes suicide and violence. Could you please tell me the name of that, the statistics you referred to there? Was it Yolanda, somebody that produced that research on violence and suicides under the influence of psychotropic drugs?
Oh yes, you can get the slides afterwards. They are not secret. They are actually on film.
Next.
Hi Peter. I wanted to ask about neuroleptics and whether you've done much research on that, and a specific question about a person who's been on it over 5 years and has horrible neck movements and pain and wants to be off the drugs, but the psychiatrist keeps her on with a treatment order. Is there anything that you give that we could use as Australians to sort of leverage and change things for a person? And there's many people in a situation like that, in incredible pain, wanting to be off the drugs, and the psychiatrists say, no, you're not allowed. And this is not a person who's been a criminal or anything.
Yes. I regard the most important chapter in my forthcoming book, the one on forced treatment. I have tried to argue very carefully why I consider forced treatment a violation of human rights. This should be banned by law in all countries over the world, because there is an extreme power imbalance between a psychiatrist and a patient. And many patients have wished to come off their antipsychotics and felt very badly about them, and many of them have experienced that when they complain about them, the response is to increase the dose or to add another drug, increasing the risk of sudden death. So very many people are killed in psychiatry out of good intentions, but doctors should not be allowed to kill patients who feel themselves, this drug is dangerous for me, I want to come off it. They must respect that. And in order to arrive at that point, we must put a law ban on all forced treatments. This is inhuman.
Yes? Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. I'd like to follow up on the pain issue. My name is David Murphy, and on August the 16th last year, my wife Marilyn took her own life. 4 days after being released from the Victoria Clinic, where she underwent rapid detoxification from a low dose of Valium, 6.5 milligrams. Marilyn was an involuntary medical addict, desperate to get off benzodiazepines, but suffered horrendous side effects and withdrawal symptoms. She consulted widely, including psychiatrists at the Albert Road Clinic, a facility associated with the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Melbourne. The specialist who seemed to best understand the nature and severity of her pain and not simply attribute it to anxiety was a consultant neurologist. Marilyn's time in the Victoria Clinic was overseen by an addiction specialist. My personal knowledge of Marilyn's health and mental state, along with her extensive writing of notes, emails and discussion board activity, overwhelmingly reveal that she took her life because of pain, not depression.
Thank you.
Can I just... there is a question.
We're all sharing your pain, but we really need to get the question because there are other people asking questions.
I'm sorry. As a family, we're seeking a full coronial inquiry, but my question is, what else can we do? Can we be of any help to you? I'm sorry to have taken so long.
The question is, what can the community do to help prevent those situations?
Well, what I try to do is that after I published my crime book in September 2013 with 2 chapters in psychiatry, about psychiatry, I've been surprised how much these 2 chapters have meant. They have meant that I have become a member of several international networks, also of critical psychiatrists that have let me into their circles, and I'm very happy about that. I should say there are lots of very, very good psychiatrists, and some of them are in this room today. And many people would like to revolutionize psychiatry, but the problem is that those at the top, they have a lot of power. So if you are going to get your next post in the hospital system, you better not be too difficult. It's very, very much top-down steered. But we must do what we can to help each other. And patients and relatives are very important in the fight that we have started. And lawsuits, please do lawsuits. Those of you who have the economy to do it, challenge the medical profession, challenge everything in lawsuits. There was a good lawyer in Alaska that won a case in the Supreme Court in Alaska, which was about forced drugging. I think it was with an antipsychotic. And he won the case because he convinced the judges that it's not such a good idea to force an antipsychotic drug on a patient because they have terrible harms and kill a lot of people. So it's not obvious that this is good for the patient. So what the verdict was that if you can provide an alternative, then you are obliged not to force people to take antipsychotics. That was a big victory for human rights. I have met with this lawyer in Los Angeles last year, and I intend to collaborate with him. We must raise a lot of lawsuits all over the world.
Alternating the microphones, yes, here, thank you.
I've been a general practitioner in Melbourne and other countries briefly for 45 years, more than 45 years. I'm now an integrative GP and a psychotherapist. Now I have personal and clientele professional history that supports what you're saying today. And I found that the system is very ignorant, ingrained, and powerful, as you say. And sometimes it works together with the official so-called legal systems like the community treatment orders, the non-custodial supervision order, which is a court order, and also the legal system. Now, personally, I've found that if I speak up in any way, one gets threatened or, threatened with being brought before the medical board. This is the history of integrative medicine when it first started in Melbourne. My question is, what can we do collectively here while we have all these people, hopefully most of them supportive of your lecture, to start something going here in Melbourne and in Australia? And two, if there are any lawyers here, please can you make yourself known so that we can have that legal nous behind us, because we need them. The system, I've gone to court for my family member, and I've been threatened to be put before the medical board just because I have an opinion about psychotropics and antipsychotics.
Thank you. We'll get a response now. If you can think of it.
Yes. There is one thing more I want to tell you about the Alaska Supreme Court case. Jim Gøtzsche, the lawyer, has written that psychiatrists very often lie in court. They lie the patients much more ill than they really are because they want to get their treatment orders, and the judges follow them because they don't have any other possibility. So there is a huge conflict of interest here that the psychiatrist is his or her own judge, and they think it's good for the patient to get this antipsychotic, and then they lie the patient sicker than the patient is, and then there is a forced treatment order. So there is a huge amount of dark side to work with here.
Thank you. It's up the back on the right. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, look, thank you for your talk, and I really hope your voice gets widely heard, certainly in Australia. And just out of interest, there is a critical psychiatry network in Australia. I think it's fledgling, but I think, responding to the lady before, there's people can look that up on the website if they're interested in joining. Look, my question is, I was really interested in your talking about detoxification centres, and wondering if there's, I don't think there's any in Australia, but just wondering if there's models overseas that could be looked at.
If there are some overseas?
A best model for detoxification for people coming off psychiatric drugs.
Yeah. They actually had a number of detoxification centres in Sweden. And what is so strange in healthcare is that whenever something very good is being established, there are very strong and powerful enemies that tear them down again. So these centers have disappeared in Sweden. But I am in contact with psychiatrists who know a lot about how you can respect patients and treat them without using force. There are good examples of that, and recently I spoke to an Icelandic psychiatrist on the phone. There was a brave psychiatrist in Iceland who in 1932 burned all straitjackets, belts, shackles. He burned them. He kept one copy which he sent to the Icelandic parliament, where it is on display today. So they don't use mechanical restraints in Iceland. And when that person worked in London, at that hospital, they use seclusion a lot, which is a room where you lock people up. And then he asked a technician to lock the door and put a sign on the door that said "out of order." And that went on for a month. And after that month, the staff had become used to not having this seclusion room. So when it was not out of order any longer, it wasn't used. And you can do the same with drugs. Often you can talk even severely psychotic people down. It takes time, but often you can do it without drugs. And if you need drugs, you can often negotiate. That's what they say in Iceland and other good places. You should negotiate with your patients. You should come on equal terms with them. And then, if they are very hurt by their emotions and psychosis, they might think, okay, fine, I can take a drug for a short while, but it's up to me to say when I think that I don't need it any longer. And that drug doesn't even need to be an antipsychotic, because there are very few studies comparing antipsychotics with benzodiazepines. But the few studies there are indicate that benzodiazepines can also calm schizophrenic patients down. So why give them such dangerous drugs that kill so many of them if you could use benzodiazepines? There is a lot you could think about in psychiatry. We just need something going.
Good evening, Peter. Thank you for your talk tonight. It was very interesting. One of the things that I was most interested in was the power of the placebo effect, that if you tell somebody that there is going to be an objective effect of a drug, then subjectively they'll report that this drug does have a greater effect than if they're blinded to whether or not they've received the drug. And I've studied bioethics a little bit in philosophy classes at university, and there's this distinction between hard paternalism and soft paternalism in healthcare, and it seems like there's a perceptual problem between patient and psychotherapist or psychiatrist. Psychotherapist. Yeah, you know what I mean. In that there's a power relationship there, and the idea is that people go to this person to receive help, rather than this person is working together with somebody to help them. And I'm wondering if there's any advice that you can provide just to everybody in the room, basic advice to help approach that problem of paternalism, hard paternalism versus soft paternalism in a more productive way, to sort of get around that power play problem.
Yeah. Yeah. What can I say? I think I agree with you. We must come away from paternalism because it is so harmful. The intentions are good, but the result is harmful. So if you get away from paternalism and think about autonomy, because you have a psychosis, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are incapable of making any rational judgments. So you should respect that person in that condition as a fellow human being and drop your paternalism. Of course, psychiatrists do this because they want to benefit their patients. I have been pretty tough on psychiatrists tonight, and for a good reason. But of course they want to benefit their patients. They're not evil people. But we know perfectly well that power corrupts. And as the Brit told me, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And therefore we need to redress the balance. Because in any human relationship where there is a very skewed power balance, it will go wrong. I don't know of any examples where it doesn't go wrong in human relationships. There's one thing more I want to tell you, and that is that since psychiatrists and others have difficulty distinguishing between disease symptoms and drug side effect symptoms and abstinence symptoms, there is a huge risk, and this also happens, that whenever some symptom occurs, the psychiatrist is likely to call it a disease symptom. So take a boy on an ADHD drug, and that boy becomes manic because it's a stimulant. Then it's likely the psychiatrist might say, now the boy has become bipolar, so the boy also needs lithium or an antipsychotic. And if you get an antidepressant, they can also be stimulating, and you get some kind of psychosis. Then before you know it, You also have a psychosis diagnosis and you are in treatment with 2 drugs, and so on. So Peter Breggin, an American psychiatrist, has suggested, and I'm totally in agreement with him, psychiatrists and other doctors should never come up with a new diagnosis as long as the brain they have in front of them is already under influence of a drug. They need to take the patient off that drug before they can say anything about whether this is a true bipolar disorder, whether it's a true psychosis, a true new depression in a psychotic patient who got antipsychotics or whatever it is. So this is one important reason why, if you get in contact with psychiatry, you might not get out with 1 diagnosis, but with 3, and with a lot of drugs that is very harmful for you. So this little thing alone, if we could tell psychiatrists it's forbidden for you to come up with more diagnoses when you have already changed the brain on that poor person.
Thank you. Professor, you've talked about the problem with psychiatry, but I wonder to what extent you think this problem actually exists in primary care. I've seen figures that suggest that something like 80% of these medications in Australia are being prescribed by GPs.
Yes. Yes. Well, the reason I focus on psychiatrists is that they have the ultimate responsibility. If GPs are doing badly, the psychiatrists have a responsibility of telling them you're doing badly. You should do differently. So I feel they have the responsibility. They have their specialty, and you're absolutely right. Here in Australia, I think around 85% of all antidepressants are prescribed by GPs, and now they also use antipsychotics as if they were small psychiatrists. And they know far too little about these drugs. Even the psychiatrists know far too little about the drugs. So it's far too dangerous to have GPs use brain-active chemicals. So I would prefer they didn't, and that they focus on other things, but didn't use psychiatric drugs. And if we limit psychiatric drug prescription to psychiatrists, there would be far fewer people who can prescribe them, so far fewer people would get on them. That would be a huge step forward for mental health. So let's ban use of psychotropic drugs in GPs. And you know, I have discussed this with Danish GPs, and one guy who was supposed to know a lot about psychiatry, he told me, okay, psychotherapy, yes. Psychotherapy is good for mild depression, but it takes a time before you can get an appointment. So in the waiting time, it's good to give them an antidepressant to somehow bridge from the current situation to the psychotherapy. But these drugs don't work in mild depression. Everybody agrees on that. So it's just flabbergasting what people tell me. How can they?
A gentleman halfway back, then the front row, halfway back, and then down here, and I've got 2 hands over. I've got 3 hands over here. But the first is the
Hi, you haven't mentioned anything about electroshock therapy. Have you done any research on that and its effects?
Well, I have a man sitting in front of me from the UK who knows a lot about electroshock. But I also met an Irish psychiatrist who was a strong man in Irish psychiatry, and he has published his autobiography where he says, he's now 84, he says, I reserved electroshock to really life-threatening situations. I have never seen a patient in a life-threatening situation, so I never used electroshock. There are these people who don't use electroshock. And since it likely leads to brain damage, like all the psychotropic drugs do, I believe it's also a violation of human rights to use electroshock on them if they haven't agreed themselves. It should be banned, if you ask me. But if John would like to comment, you know much more about it. Well, maybe not, but...
Yes.
Hi,
My name's John Reed, and I'm the person that Peter was referring to. As of Monday, this is really nice for me, because as of Monday, I've been a professor of clinical psychology at your Swinburne University after 20 years in New Zealand. So I was kind of scared about coming to Australia, because along with America, it is well known internationally that it's got one of the most biological and least psychosocial mental health services in the world. Don't know if you know that, sitting in Australia. So how amazing to be at a meeting like this on my third day. So this is pretty cool. I could talk about the largest online survey we did in New Zealand of antidepressant recipients, but I won't, because it just confirms everything Peter said. I'll mention something more optimistic, because a lot of the questions have been about what can we do to change this. And so I don't have the answer to that after fighting for 40 years on the same issues. If I had the answer to that, we'd have sorted it a long time ago. But what I think you need to hold on to is that in 27 countries around the world, when you do surveys of the public about what they think causes mental health problems, it's all psychosocial and not biochemical. The public does not believe in the biogenetic model, and the public in every country except America, but they get everything wrong, don't they, prefers psychotherapy to drugs. So we are the majority when you think about, changing things. We just have to keep battling away. It's only a very tiny minority of people, but as Peter says, they are very powerful. Sorry, this is turning into a lecture. I didn't mean to, but just wanted to say hello to everybody, and it's lovely to be in Melbourne.
Thank you. A lady over here. We've got 3 or 4 hands up. We'll get to you perhaps. We've got about 3 or 4 more minutes, so we'll keep the questions short.
Yeah, and thank you very much for the discussion and for the really great lecture. My question's around detoxification as well. With this Swedish place that was closed down, I'm a naturopath. I work in detoxification, have successfully helped quite a few people off antidepressants, and it's very difficult. I'd love you to share perhaps what the Swedish people were doing in terms of use of supplementation, nutrients, herbal, also, lifestyle, exercise, even hydrotherapy. I don't know what they were doing over there. I'm curious to hear what was successful for them, if you know.
Well, you mentioned a lot of alternative therapies, and if we use fewer psychiatric drugs, it doesn't mean that we should accept treatments with an unproven benefit. After all, I am a specialist in internal medicine. I don't like using treatments, whatever they are, if we don't know if they have any benefit. They need to be tested in randomized trials, just like everything else. That's my advice.
A lady in the front row, you still got a question? Sorry.
Thank you, Peter. I was just wondering, what's your opinion on functional medicine that seems to be coming out of the United States, and functional psychology, psychiatry, endocrinology?
I never heard the term functional something.
Okay.
What is that?
I guess it's sort of branching from integrative medicine, but they really do look at the gut system and the microbiome to actually heal even psychotic behaviours. So they really do look at the gut and toxic levels in the body.
Well, I think I just replied to that before, that there are lots of ideas out there, and we should not go from one problem to the other. We should use treatments that we know work, and psychotherapy and human empathy and understanding and listening to psychotic patients, although they may tell you a lot of nonsense. It actually helps them, that you respect them and listen when they say they are Napoleon or whatever it is. It actually helps them to feel respected in their pain. So all these ideas about the gut and what else, well, I have had a long career in healthcare research, and well, yeah. Could I avoid responding more than that, please?
That's sufficient. We'll take 2 more questions on this microphone, and I think that will be it. Yes, please.
Okay.
And then the gentleman a row in front of you.
Thank you. I'm probably the only criminologist here, I think. Peter knows. And for years I have looked at the Russian mafia. These are children next to them. Now, one of the areas that the mafia are strong in is intimidation and a culture of violence and control. And I've heard about intimidation here. I'm actually interested in how people are intimidated, whether you've been intimidated, the modes of intimidation, because this is the one thing that stops people speaking out, both patients, practitioners, and academics. So I'm an associate professor of international criminology at UWS. Peter, have you been intimidated and how? And I would be interested from other people perhaps afterwards. Thank you.
I certainly have. I raised a number of issues in a Danish newspaper article which was translated into English and which is up on Mad in America and David Healy's website, 10 Myths in Psychiatry. Some months later, the Danish Psychiatric Association tried to somehow silence me or kill me or whatever. So they wrote a letter to the Cochrane Collaboration, whether the Cochrane Collaboration agreed with my views on psychiatric drugs, which is a pretty foolish idea because the Cochrane Collaboration doesn't have any official views about my views. I'm free to have my own views. They're based on science. But somehow this got wrong. And a letter was sent back that wasn't carefully thought through, and it exploded in the hands of Danish journalists. I'm often in the media in Denmark and well known there, and it just exploded that now Cochrane denounces Peter Gøtzsche and his book and all his works, something like that. You know, journalists, when they go berserk, they can get the most fantastic things out of a letter that was not meant this way. So it exploded. So what I've created, my center, was threatened because I'm on government money. And if I'm seen as a difficult person, politicians might think it's better to get rid of that guy. So yes, it was absolutely terrible what I experienced in April last year when I sat in a jungle in Panama among spiders and parrots and couldn't defend myself. I didn't have contact to the outside world apart from some quite primitive equipment when everybody tried to get at me in Denmark. But it has settled down now. And one of the things they came after was that I said that if doctors don't become better at handling these drugs, which are double-edged swords, then we were better without them. But I wrote both before and after that remark that what I wanted was that we use them far less and mostly in acute situations and with a plan of tapering them off quite quickly. But everybody misused the sentence in the middle, that if we are not able to do that, it would be better we didn't have the drugs. So you can say I made an error. I gave them something they could abuse, and my goodness, they did abuse this. But then I was invited to an international conference in Los Angeles in November to give a talk about psychiatric drugs for a society called the International Society of Ethical Psychology and Psychiatry. And they issued a press release before the meeting where they stated that the speakers at this meeting, which involved some of the most prominent psychiatrists you know about, Alan Francis, who was chairman of the DSM-4 Bible of Psychiatric Diagnosis, David Healy and other people. The press release said that the speakers at this meeting agree that the way psychiatry currently functions do more harm than good. Something like that. Exactly what I had said in a newspaper article some months earlier, but I almost died by so doing, professionally, I mean.
Very difficult. Very last question in the centre, thank you.
Yes, my colleagues here and I are in a similar field to Dr. Lucia, pharmacogenomics, where we try to understand how the drugs work. And certainly in our experience, many medical practitioners confuse the side effects of the drugs with mental health symptoms. But what I wanted to ask you was about drug withdrawal. Just for everybody here, it's not just you who said you should withdraw very slowly from these type of drugs. There are official recommendations to suggest you do so. But we seem to see over and over that apart from the psychiatrists who want to keep the patients on the drugs forever, if they're changing drugs, so many believe in cold turkey coming off. Now, why is this so? Why do they just think that you can just stop these drugs overnight or the next day?
I have some problems with the Australian accent, and then you're a bit in the distance, so I apologize for that. Maybe you can tell me?
I was having a bit of trouble as well, but it was basically about the problem of doctors not following national guidelines on gradual withdrawal. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, so many just think if you change your drug, you stop one drug one day and go on to another one the next day.
Yes. Well, I don't know whether doctors follow national guidelines or whether the guidelines are good enough, which they often aren't, because they build on a deeply flawed research literature. So we all suffer from the fact that much of the research that is being published isn't reliable. But what can we do? In Cochrane, in guidelines, we do our best and try to make up for the biases as I've showed you this evening. So I don't think I can respond to it more than that.
We are over time, and it is now time to conclude. And people who've got personal questions, you might be able to come up and speak with Peter, but I do want to finish on time. I'm sorry for the gentleman in the centre. It's very unkind of me, but we have to stop. It remains to thank Peter. An amazing presentation, a very courageous man doing wonderful work, so thank him very much.